Good evening. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out tonight. It is great to see such a nice crowd. To welcome back our speaker this evening, David Firestein, for his comeback return. He was the first speaker that we had post-COVID, and we have him here again tonight. So welcome. We're so happy. I will turn over the mic to the one and only Mr. Jim Falk, right here.
David and I had the chance to become acquainted and become friends because we both serve on the advisory board of the Asia Society Texas Center, which if you're in Houston ever, let me know, because they have a building that is worth seeing, and they often have art exhibitions, and just terrific. David Firestein, former Foreign Service officer, 2 decades as a career officer, served in a number of posts, including Moscow, and we will probably touch on that tonight as well. But what brings him here tonight in particular is that he is the founding executive director of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. And all of you know that Ambassador Bush and Barbara Bush had some of their happiest years and, in a sense, the most productive diplomatic years when they served in Beijing. David was previously executive director of the UT, University of Texas, guess in Santa Fe I need to say that, University of Texas at Austin, China Public Policy Center, and also a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I hope that David will not suddenly fall into Mandarin, but he might, because he received the Linguist of the Year award in 1997, and he was the first and perhaps the only U.S. diplomat to publish a regular column in a Beijing newspaper. Don't know if he could do that today or not. Received his degrees at Georgetown, BA. Was that the School of Foreign Service?
Yes, it was.
And 2 masters, again from UT Austin. You know, it's nice being here because you can say UT Austin and not have people start hollering and putting up their arms and all types of odd things.
I restrained myself.
Good, thank you. Anyway, welcome.
Jim, thank you so much. It really is a delight to be here. Thank you so much. Jim is a dear friend and a great collaborator, and I just have to say it is always a delight to be back in the city different. It is different, and I love it. My family loves it, and it's just a pleasure to be here and to be with such a wonderful group of folks. So thank you for the precious gift of your time. Jim, thank you. Sean, thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
So David, as you know, when we started talking about this, we really carefully designed having 3 programs on China. And this is part of our China series because you can tell just by the support and interest that people want to know more about what's happening. And I'm going to read the same quote that I read when Jonathan Ward was here by Henry Kissinger. First, how many people were here for Jonathan Ward? I'm curious to see. Great. Henry Kissinger told the Economist when they did that incredible interview on really to celebrate his 100th his centennial birthday. Kissinger said, "We are in the classic pre-World War I situation where neither side has much margin of political concession in which any disturbance of the equilibrium can lead to catastrophic consequences." I'm also going to refer to an interview that took place yesterday. Council on Foreign Relations yesterday had Richard Haass interviewed Secretary Blinken. How many people, did anybody see that? So one of the things that Secretary Blinken said was he described the goal of U.S. foreign policy in China was to have peaceful coexistence. And he said to do that, we need, 1, to build better lines of communication. We need to deal directly with profound differences, and we find ways to cooperate. So to begin our conversation, I'd like you to react to those 2 quotes, or the 2 statements.
Well, Jim, thanks very much. And I think, first of all, Secretary Kissinger is right when he points out that the situation right now between the United States and China is suboptimal. We have a relationship that is in some ways not functional, in some ways certainly not constructive, and I would say not sustainable. It doesn't mean we're going to go to war tomorrow or anytime soon. I don't think that's going to happen. But it is in a problematic and strained and challenged place. And I think Secretary Kissinger is right when he says that this is a sensitive and delicate moment, and the potential for the relationship to go even further south than it's already gone is there. So I agree with the thrust of the comment by Secretary Kissinger. In terms of Secretary Blinken, I think he's said it very well. I think what he has articulated is a realistic set of goals, if you will, for the U.S.-China relationship at this point. Having high-level lines of communication between our presidents, our secretaries of state, our cabinet officials, and other senior and, for that matter, mid-level diplomats and officials, I think that is really important. And candidly, there hasn't been enough government-to-government engagement around a whole slew of really complex and difficult issues. And with Secretary Blinken's recent visit to China, I think we're starting to see potentially movement back in a direction in which those lines of communication are restored and in a sense reinvigorated to a certain degree. I think that's good. He also mentioned that we have to recognize that we have profound differences. And the reality is that we do have not only profound differences, but as I have argued in recent speeches over the last few years, the positions of the United States and China on most major issues on the bilateral agenda are absolutely irreconcilable. We will never agree on human rights, on Taiwan, on the validity of China's claims in the South China Sea, on what's happening in Hong Kong, and a variety of other issues, even the degree that's appropriate for a government to be involved in managing a national economy or managing international trade. So there are some things that are not only tough issues, they're issues we're not going to agree on. And that leads to the third point that I think Secretary Blinken rightly points out, and that is, well, let's talk about the areas where it is in our mutual self-interest to actually work together and do some things not out of a spirit of altruism, but because it actually advances our national interest. And I think that trifecta of points that Secretary Blinken makes about the lines of communication, the difficulty of some of the profound issues on our agenda, and the need to really hone in on the issues where we can and should work together because it's in our interest to do so, I think that's a very realistic approach, and I salute him for articulating that.
I want to come back to some of those issues where we can cooperate, but first, let's hear from your daughter, who has an opportunity and has had the opportunity to meet so many people from China as well as American observers. Come on up here, Ellie. And if you'll stand on the stage.
Jim, thank you so much.
It's on.
Thank you, Mr. Jim. So my name is Eliana Firestein. I'll be talking about the agreements and disagreements of the U.S. and the U.S.-China relationship between the two countries. So there's not very many agreements, but there's loads of disagreements, among others. So my first topic will be talking about the agreements between the two countries. So the U.S. doesn't really agree with China on a lot of things, and China doesn't really agree with the U.S. on a lot of things. An example of one of the things they do not they disagree on is that they disagree on Taiwan, among others and others. I bet there's hundreds of things that they disagree on. But my next topic will be my dad's organization and what he tries to work for between the two countries. So my dad's organization tries to help China and the U.S. get along better or understand each other more and hopefully become friends, but that's the next step of the stage. And he tries to get us to be more, like I could say, bonded, but not at that point yet. My final topic will be that the ambassador of China, the Chinese ambassador, has visited our house and at a, what's it called?
A reception.
Reception. And we were talking about the U.S. and China relationships between both countries, and we both agree on that. We hope that China and the U.S. will get along better and that we can bond more, and I think that's it.
And is that
India, and the Chinese ambassador is now the top diplomat for China.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Jim here.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I think Ellie framed it.
We're done here,
Yeah.
folks. That's pretty much it.
What a way to promote your think tank, I tell you. Tricky. So let's go back to Blinken's comments, and where can we and where must we cooperate?
Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that question. I think the less profound response is there are some areas in the policy arena where we have to cooperate, again, out of mutual self-interest, because neither country has the ability to solve the particular problem on its own. Climate change is exactly probably the leading area where the involvement of the United States and China is integral. I would say necessary but not sufficient, but certainly necessary to advance the global agenda in terms of climate change as the number one and number two carbon emitters in the world. So that's one area, working together to prevent catastrophic outcomes on the Korean Peninsula associated with North Korea's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons. That's another area, working on Iran, working on piracy on the high seas, working on pandemics, the next pandemic, and how we can work together to actually generate better results for both countries and for the world. I know that may sound like a very politically charged topic, and it is in the United States, but the fact is the next pandemic at some point is going to happen, and I think both countries have a lot of experiences, both positive and negative, that we can and should share with each other to try to generate a better outcome. So there are a number of issues that I think we need to work together on to get the results that all of us want to get. And there is a commonality of national interest around some of those areas. The more profound answer, in a sense, it's a less ambitious and more ambitious goal, is around the issue of Taiwan. Taiwan is often cited as the one area that could potentially lead to a kinetic U.S.-China military conflict, to war. And we can talk more about that perhaps, but I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. But it is true to say, and fair to say, that Taiwan is a serious potential flashpoint. As I mentioned a minute ago, the reality is that the United States and China are not going to agree on the fundamental issues associated with the question of Taiwan and the cross-strait picture. But the one thing that we can agree on, the one thing that we do agree on, and the one common interest that we have, is to prevent war from occurring over Taiwan and across the Taiwan Strait. War that would be catastrophic for everyone involved and for the world. And that actually is a common goal.
David, let me jump in here, though,
Yeah.
because she has stated that the Taiwan issue cannot be passed on for future generations. And it's also been reported that he has charged his military to be ready by 2027. And so this is so different than the prior leaders of China.
Well, you're absolutely right that President Xi Jinping has articulated a much greater sense of urgency around this issue than his predecessors did. That being said, I think it's really important to draw the distinction between being ready to do something and actually doing it. We are ready to destroy the planet Earth with nuclear weapons. We have the capability to do it in about 25 minutes. That doesn't mean we're going to do it. So having a capability, and you're exactly right, that's what he said. Having a capability is one thing. Acting upon that capability is a different matter. And the way I would put it, Jim, is every day that China doesn't go into Taiwan militarily is a day that, in my judgment, the Chinese leadership looks at the picture and assesses that the costs of doing that outweigh the benefits. Because after all, if the benefits in their assessment outweighed the costs, they would do it. By definition, you would tend to do what benefits you more. But I think that China's leadership correctly assesses that those costs would be at a level that China is unwilling to bear. And I think that is going to be true for a very long time to come. It is true, perhaps, and we'll see how it plays out by 2027, that China's capabilities will be at a qualitatively different level, and that they'll possess capabilities that are different 3 or 4 years from now than they are today. But that doesn't necessarily portend that China is going to take action until such time as they believe that the benefits outweigh the costs. And I don't think that's going to happen for a very, very long time.
How do you define strategic ambiguity, and how has President Biden's 4 statements where he has said that the United States will come to the defense of Taiwan, which has been walked back just yesterday by Secretary Blinken at a Council on Foreign Relations?
In a humorous way.
In a humorous way.
Well, yes, it's a great question. And, strategic ambiguity refers to a very specific policy of the United States, whereby, as a matter of policy dating back to the 1970s and to arguably the present day, the United States has said, we are not going to telegraph what we would do in the eventuality of China waging a military invasion of Taiwan. We're simply not going to do. In fact, we don't necessarily even know. We would have to assess what has happened and calibrate our response accordingly. And that's known as strategic ambiguity, because we don't say, if you do this, I will do that. We've refrained from that. And as Jim, as you've pointed out, President Biden himself has directly contravened that policy and been very clear when asked on multiple occasions. And it was not a gaffe or not a slip of the tongue, because it was very intentional, very clear, and well articulated. He said, including in one instance on a 60 Minutes interview, if China were to launch an invasion on Taiwan, I, as Commander-in-Chief, would send U.S. forces to defend Taiwan. And that is a major departure from stated U.S. policy. And as Jim, you pointed out, it was walked back by the White House. And it's been walked back a number of times by both the White House and the State Department. So I guess what I would say as a humorous conclusion to this response, it is pretty ambiguous because there have been very mixed signals about what we would do or wouldn't do. And quite candidly, intentionally or unintentionally, President Biden has contributed to the ambiguity by muddying the waters and saying what we would do when the stated policy is that we don't know what we would do.
So is that by design? One would hope so, maybe.
Can I give you my candid response to that?
I hope so. And to everyone out there?
No, I just want to give it to you, and don't listen to this part. Here's what I think, and I mean it with no disrespect to anyone, at least of all the President of the United States, but I believe that the most plausible explanation for why the sitting U.S. President would make this type of unprecedented statement, namely a stated commitment to send troops to defend Taiwan, something, by the way, we're not doing even relative to Ukraine, which is a nation that we recognize. Taiwan's not even a nation that we recognize. We don't recognize Taiwan as a country. So, interesting question. I think the reason he did it is because he knows that whether he is a one-term president or two-term president, that invasion is not going to happen on his watch. Therefore, staking out a very tough and bold position on the public record is an easy way to demonstrate toughness on the issue of Taiwan and on the issue of China that comes at no cost to him, because he will not be president if and when, at some point in the distant future, China ever does this thing, invades Taiwan. So it's a way of scoring a point without having to bear the consequences of acting upon that commitment. In my judgment, that is probably the calculation that was made, and by the way, it inoculates President Biden and the Democratic Party from charges from the Republican Party as we go into the 2024 presidential election that the Democratic Party is weak on China, because no Republican president has ever said that the United States would defend Taiwan. So it becomes very difficult to outflank the Democratic Party when the sitting president has made that commitment, a commitment he will never have to fulfill, as he well knows. That's my interpretation. I think that is a plausible explanation. It's just speculation, but that's how I see it.
Let me just read this quote, and those of you who watch Fareed Zakaria, you may remember it, but Jake Sullivan was on just a few weeks ago, and Sullivan said, "The one China policy, if you begin to unpack it, you will recognize that it's about dealing in a world of internal tension within the policy and trying to manage these tensions effectively to ensure peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait." Sullivan says, "This is not a model of clarity, the one China policy." Very, gets back to what you were saying.
Absolutely. And the thing that I would add to that, Jim, it's I think something that is often hard for our Chinese friends to understand is that in the end, the U.S. policy toward Taiwan and the one China policy itself means what the United States says that it means at that moment in time by definition. It is for the United States to understand and execute the policy as it sees fit. Oftentimes Chinese will say, well, what you're doing, what you, the United States, are doing is not in alignment with your own stated policy. And the reality is, it's always in alignment because it is for the United States to say what is in alignment with the policy, even when it's not in alignment. So there is that inherent ambiguity, and there is a flexibility and a malleability to the policy so that it can mean different things at different times. And quite candidly, I think the U.S. mindset about Taiwan and U.S. policy toward Taiwan have changed in recent years. I don't think there's any question about that. The United States says that our policy remains unchanged, and in fact, Secretary Blinken said that yesterday, as you were alluding to. But the reality is it has changed, but it's the prerogative of the United States to shift how we understand that policy and execute that policy in the face of developments across the strait. So there is some ambiguity there.
What type of domestic pressure does President Xi have? Because when he's been so outspoken about the reunification in 2027, and essentially he has put himself to be leader for life.
Well, I think there's no question that China is seeking to give itself a military capability that will enable it to potentially take Taiwan by force if that ultimately becomes the last resort and a necessary means of achieving the objective of what China calls reunification. China has always said consistently, and they say today, our goal is reunification through peaceful means, but we don't take the use of force off the table in the event that that is required. And China is trying to gear up to be able to potentially fulfill that pledge, if you will. That being said, I don't think there is any external pressure on Xi Jinping that President Xi Jinping hasn't placed on himself. So I don't think he has to respond to the Chinese public or to the Chinese military. He is the unitary leader of China. He is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the President of the country, the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, along with a number of other important titles. Those are the three most important, with General Secretary being the most important. And he doesn't have to answer ultimately to anybody. So ultimately he will weigh the costs and the benefits, and he'll assess the politics of the issue through the prism of the costs and benefits. In my judgment, the fundamental calculus of President Xi and the Chinese leadership around Taiwan is not going to change anytime soon, because I think the costs of China going into Taiwan would be incredible, and I don't think China is prepared to bear those costs, and I don't think it will be prepared to bear those costs for a long time to come.
And the cost that Russia has suffered is perhaps a good example of what might happen.
I would agree with that. And you look at the situation in terms of Russia-Ukraine. Russia's unlawful, unprovoked, unjustified, and frankly deplorable invasion of a fellow United Nations member state. Absolutely shameful. And Russia has paid a very heavy price, not in terms of outright military conflict with the United States or NATO, but in terms of becoming essentially a pariah in the world of nations among nations. And China doesn't want to become a pariah. It can't afford to become a pariah state. And I sometimes quip, and I have to think about whether this is overly simplistic or a fair assessment, that the reason Russia ultimately could go into Ukraine is because Russia matters a lot less in the global economy than China does. China actually matters. China is the number 2 economy. China is the number 1 trading partner of 2/3 of the countries of the world. It's the number 3 trading partner of the United States, and the number 1 trading partner of the United States that doesn't have a contiguous border with our nation. So China actually has to think about the consequences to a degree that Russia doesn't, because quite candidly, Russia, while important, is far more marginal to the global economy, and a lot more marginal today than it was before the invasion than China is. So, China looks at Russia, Ukraine, and to your point, Jim, I agree. I think it draws the conclusion that even shy of warfare, the costs of going into Taiwan are great, the risks are extraordinary, and the potential for what the Communist Party in China would view as a catastrophic outcome for itself are significant, because if you lose that conflict, you probably lose China as the ruling party. And so I think that's a high gamble, high risk play that I don't think China is prepared to do at any time in the foreseeable future.
Yet, China has spent an enormous amount of money on building its Navy. It's the world's largest Navy now. It has an incredible air defense system. Am I correct that it still only has 1 military base at Djibouti?
Yes,
but it seems like it's poised to create a lot more. So what is their military objective?
Well, it's a great question, and I think, let me answer that in 2 ways. First of all, there is an official political slogan of Xi Jinping, and you might call it the national ideology and the national slogan. And it's these words, it's exactly these words as rendered into the official English. The rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. The rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. If we translated that into the American vernacular, it would be make China great again. That is quite literally, and I mean that not even facetiously, that's literally what China aspires to do. It was a great country once, and this is in its own view, and it seeks to regain that greatness by every metric that's important: military, economic, influence in the world, and so on and so forth, technology. So, China wants to be great again. It wants to have a military that is capable of defending China's interests overseas, and in particular around its periphery. And the one point that I often
So does great mean take the place of the United States in the liberal world order?
I'm going to answer that in 1 second, because that's a really important question, and I want to comment on that. But the point that I would make is that China aspires to not have to take orders from anyone else in the world. It had a history, as we all understand, of humiliation, the so-called century of humiliation from the mid-1800s to 1949. It was carved up, it was bullied, it was beaten down by various countries in the world, and it basically said, never again. And so China seeks to be a great power. To your question, whether China seeks to displace the United States as the world's only superpower, as we define the term, I think there is debate in the United States. I would give you my response to your question and say, in my judgment, that China does not seek to supplant the United States as the world's only superpower as we define the term superpower. They don't want that. They don't want the responsibilities associated with it. They don't want the costs measured in trillions and trillions of US dollars associated with that role. They don't want to write human rights reports about every country in the world, because frankly, they don't give a damn about human rights in all the other countries of the world. They don't seek to sit in judgment of every country of what they did right and what they did wrong. They don't want to be the world policeman. They don't want boots on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan. They don't want any of the things that comes with superpowerdom the way we define superpowerdom. They just want to be able to defend themselves, to advance their interests, to defend their economic interests in terms of energy flows from the Middle East and elsewhere into China, and similar considerations. But in my judgment, they don't seek to supplant the United States. And there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. that would disagree with that. But if you look at China's history, and if you look at China's own stated aspirations and its sense of who it is as a nation among nations, I think it's a profound misreading of China. And I think it has led the United States to miscalibrate our policy response to China, because we're fundamentally predicating that policy in flawed assumptions about what China wants.
You know, obviously we don't know, I don't know what was said between Putin and Xi before the invasion of Ukraine, but clearly in February there was a meeting and a coming of minds, and I'm sure that Xi is not happy where Russia is today. But what do you make of that special relationship?
Well, it's a great question, Jim, and you know, I would say a few things. One, probably most fundamentally from my standpoint, I think that the fact that the U.S.-China relationship has soured and deteriorated to the stark degree that it has in recent years, particularly really dating back to 2017, arguably a little earlier, but it really started with the Trump presidency, and frankly with the Trump candidacy. And the fact that it has deteriorated to that degree has caused China to reevaluate its international relations, its relationships with other countries, and to hedge against further deterioration in the relationship with the United States. And I think to a certain degree, to put it perhaps more simply, the stark deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship drove China to look at Russia differently than it had ever looked at Russia before in the modern era. And to say, look, we can't count on the United States as even a trade partner. They're sanctioning our officials, they're putting controls on the export of certain technologies, they're controlling or restricting Chinese investment into the United States. The United States is becoming very unreliable from a legislative and policy standpoint as a trading partner and as a partner, and now we need to start hedging our bets. And so I think that fundamental calculus drove China to look at Russia differently. And in my judgment, I don't claim to have the inside scoop, but I think China probably privately was nonplussed at what happened in terms of the Russia-Ukraine situation, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't think that's what China signed up for, but it is also true that China has not leveled any criticism of Russia in the public domain, but instead articulated statements that seem to be supportive of Russia's narrative, the narrative that Russia uses to justify its unlawful and shameful invasion of Ukraine. So in essence, it's tilted toward Moscow, but I think it's a delicate balancing act, because I think what Russia has done has made China very uncomfortable, and candidly it has put China in a difficult and tenuous and awkward position of not condemning a flagrant infringement of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is in precise contrast to China's stated commitment to its own principles of what he refers to as the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which include the sanctity of sovereignty and territorial integrity. So it's kind of made a liar of China in that regard, and I think China got more than it bargained for.
David, you noticed that the relationship deteriorated in 2017 with the Trump administration. Were you surprised that President Biden did not take a different position to try to create closer relationships earlier? It looks to me like now he's trying to dance on both sides, but because the Biden administration on the tariffs really is not any different than Trump, if not harder.
Jim, you're exactly right, and I was a bit surprised. I said at the time that I didn't, after President Biden was elected, and before he took office, I said at the time I didn't think there was going to be a night and day difference in the way that the United States looked at China, but I thought there would be some shifts, not inconsequential, at the margins. I thought one of the areas where we could potentially see progress was in getting rid of the consumer gouging, job-killing tariffs that we did to ourselves under President Trump, and that in fairness, President Biden has in fact continued. The reason I thought that we could potentially see a change in that particular area is because candidate Biden and candidate Kamala Harris said on their respective debate stages, and they said it correctly, the tariffs are horrible for America, as I think all of us understand. And there's no question that that's so. They're a U.S. tax on the American people that cause all kinds of problems: spikes in unemployment, shortages of goods, increased prices for everyone. Oh, and by the way, Trump ended up running the largest deficit with China in the history of the United States and had the largest average annual merchandise deficit of any president in the history of our nation. It was a complete failure. I thought that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris would lead the charge in undoing that. They didn't. And it's like the old Verizon commercial where the guy says to the CEO says, "I'm sticking it to the man," and the assistant says, "But you are the man." And the guy, you remember that one? And the guy says, "Yes." And so the assistant says, "Well, so you're sticking it to yourself?" And he says, "Maybe." That's what we're doing. We're sticking it to ourselves. I thought that would change. I thought we might consider reopening the consulates. I thought we might consider restoring the Fulbright program, the Peace Corps program, restoring high-level exchanges. I was surprised that a lot of those things didn't happen. I do think that generally the Biden administration is in a somewhat better place, at least rhetorically and tonally, than the Trump administration was in terms of the metric of advancing America's interests, which is actually the only metric that I care about or that our nation should care about. But from a substantive standpoint, Jim, you're right. There hasn't been a lot of change.
And it's going to be hard for there to be change when you start looking at 2024.
No question about it. And that goes back to the point about inoculation through various symbolic statements against political charges that you're soft on China, and I think that's what explains some of the rhetoric that we see.
You had the chance to watch the interview that we had, conversation that I had with Jonathan Ward, and many of you were in the room, and he really pushes and advocates, I think the word accurately would be economic containment of China, and as he says, America's triumph over China. Comment.
Well, first of all, I don't think you contain the number 2 economy in the world. I also don't think you contain the economy that generates $761 billion in two-way trade with the United States, which is a 2022 figure, the highest two-way trade volume the U.S. and China have ever had in history. That happened last year, 5 years into the trade war. It suggests to me that this talk of decoupling in Washington is divorced from the reality of sentiment on the part of the American consuming public, the U.S. business community, and so on. The notion of containing China, I think, is a losing proposition. But it goes to a point, Jim, that I think is very important. So much of the U.S. approach to China in recent years has really been about dragging China down. And the thing that I think we've missed as a nation in official Washington, particularly in the legislative branch, is that what we really need to be focused on is the only thing that we can actually control, and that's us. And so the analogy that I use is we're sitting in lane 1 and China's sitting in lane 2 in the blocks getting ready for the 100-meter dash. We're waiting for the gun to go off, and we're looking over at lane 2 and saying, how do we get them to run slower? And what we need to be doing is saying, how do we make ourselves run faster? And as I've argued, if we spent 1/50th of the time focusing on solving our problems rather than dragging down our competitor, we might actually have an opportunity to outcompete China, which should be our goal. So I think any notion of containing China is misguided for 2 fundamental reasons. Number one, I don't think we're going to be able to do it. This is not Grenada or Madagascar or the Solomon Islands that we're talking about. And no disrespect, but just in terms of size and heft and so on and so forth of the economy and of their involvement in the global trading regime. But the second reason is that focusing on them is a losing strategy. Because every issue that has been at the core of President Trump's agenda during those 4 years, every issue by America's own metric got worse for us during that time. So what we're doing now is not working. The ultimate metric needs to be, how do we advance our interests, not how do we score political points and win primaries. Now, I get it. I understand our system. And our system generates a type of rhetoric and a type of way of looking at China. But what I would argue is that good politics don't always generate good policy. And ultimately, the metric that matters for the American people is, have we advanced our interests as a nation? Tariffs is a good example where we clearly have not. There are others. Containment, I think, is going to be a failing strategy. We need to do what we can to defend and protect our legitimate national interests, but we need to do so recognizing that China is going to be an important player for as long as every American that's alive today is alive. And we've got to deal with it. And we've got to deal with it in a way that advances our interests.
You know, our series on China started with Kurlansky's book about public diplomacy. We have Ambassador Esquino here, who served a large part of his career in public diplomacy. That was an area that you focused on as well. Who's winning? And obviously, we're not putting enough, I think you would say clearly we're not putting enough resources in it. But how do we redesign our public diplomacy to compete better with China's?
Well, Jim, this is a really good question because it points up an interesting dichotomy between a perception that exists in the United States and a reality. So the narrative in the United States is that China is propagandizing the American people through the use of, quote, influence operations. And that it's, in a very sinister and nefarious way, infiltrating universities, think tanks, government, the media, and various other significant players. The interesting point that I often make in response to that is that U.S. negative sentiment toward China has literally never been higher. 80% of the American people, according to a recent poll by Pew earlier this year, a few months ago, 80% of the American people say that China, have an unfavorable view of China. 50% of the American people say that China is the greatest enemy of the United States of America. I wouldn't worry too much about the efficacy of Chinese propaganda efforts if we see numbers like that. I think it becomes laughable and absurd to say that China is effective in brainwashing and propagandizing the American people when 80% of the American people have starkly negative views of China, and half think that China is our enemy. So I think there is a narrative out there that is somewhat divorced from the reality. China tries to inform and influence our public opinion in support of its foreign policy objectives. Yes, it does that. It's not doing a very good job of it based on the numbers that we see. We tried to do the same thing in China. I know because I did it as a diplomat in the public diplomacy area at U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and I was very proud of the work that I did. And we all do it. Some are more effective, some are less. It's harder for the United States to be effective in terms of public diplomacy in China because it is a far more restricted environment in which to operate than the United States is for China. But that being said, I think that in the end, what we need to do is focus on us and focusing on solving our problems and enhancing our own competitive capabilities. The public diplomacy will take care of itself if we perform as a nation. You know, people often ask me if I see China as the #1 threat to the United States, and the answer is I don't, not by a long shot. The fundamental challenges and threats, I would use the word threats, that we see and that we face in this country are homegrown. January 6, 2021, I don't know about you, I didn't see a single Chinese person marching on the Capitol, on our Capitol. On January 6, 2021, I didn't see a single Chinese person indicted or convicted of seditious conspiracy, but I've seen a lot of Americans go down that road. We need to get our own house in order. We have some profound issues. Last thing I'll say is this. The gravest threat that we face in this country, in my judgment, is the untethering of political and public policy discourse from factual reality. Yeah. If we don't fix that problem, we will never outcompete China. But much more fundamentally, we will never solve the fundamental challenges that our country faces. We have a lot of work to do here. And the last thing I'll say, Jim, if we can fix these problems, we can compete more effectively, win more often, and give our kids the U.S.-China relationship and the future that they deserve. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just wondering how you feel about the symbolism and the concrete effect of the appointment of Nick Burns as ambassador to China, who I consider one of our best diplomats. So I think you've seen the change in tone since he's been there in December.
I think Ambassador Burns is an incredibly talented and gifted diplomat, one of the nation's finest, rose through the ranks of the Foreign Service and to the very top echelons of the State Department. And I think the fact that he was appointed as U.S. Ambassador to China at this moment reflects the importance that the President and our nation attaches to the relationship with China. I think he does a very fine job. He's a very seasoned and accomplished diplomat. He's in a job that's very difficult, but I don't know that there's anyone that could handle that job better than someone with his credentials and his background.
Could you speak to China owning so much of our debt and the danger of that along sort of with Saudi Arabia?
Great question.
Yeah, you know, the figure has hovered around $1 trillion. But the interesting thing is our national debt has increased significantly in recent years. So as a percentage of the debt, that number, while large, has actually gone down. Because when a trillion was a trillion out of 15 trillion or 17 trillion, it was a certain percentage. When it's a trillion out of 33 trillion and counting, it's a lower percentage. I myself tend to not overstate the leverage, quote unquote, that gives China over us. If anything, as is often pointed out, you know, when you owe the bank a little money, it's your problem. When you owe the bank a lot of money, it's their problem. And you know, the larger point I would make is that I think it's having some level of interdependence between our nations, from the standpoint of treasuries, from the standpoint of U.S.-China trade, from the standpoint of people-to-people exchanges and students and so on. Interdependence tends to prevent open warfare from occurring. One of the fundamental conceptual problems I have with the notion of decoupling from China is the very simple proposition that it actually makes war more likely. And I think war with China would be a pretty bad and indeed horrible thing for our nation and for China and for the world. Bearing in mind that both countries are nuclear weapon states with intercontinental reach, and both countries unquestionably have the ability to destroy each other, irrespective of what the other one does. So the notion of stripping away the ties that bind our countries, the idea that that makes us more secure, is not only a fallacy, it's laughable. And so I say, with respect to the issue of debt, it's not very high up on my personal list of worries with respect to vulnerability that it ostensibly creates on the part of the United States. Thank you, sir.
A question right there, the gentleman.
Thank you for your remarks, David. At the outset, you've mentioned that amongst the common areas where the U.S. and China's interests align, that constraining North Korea's nuclear ambitions was one of them. Now, clearly China has more leverage with North Korea than the U.S., despite the former administration's love letters. Why do you think China is interested in limiting North Korea's nuclear program?
It's a great question, and the short answer is I think it is true, as you say, that China does, in relative terms, have more leverage. It is on friendly terms with North Korea. It borders North Korea. There is some high-level exchange, mostly in the form of senior Chinese leaders traveling to North Korea, meeting with Kim Jong-un and others. That being said, there's no doubt in my mind that if China could wave the magic wand, it would have a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. And it would not want to see North Korea have nuclear weapons. And the main reason for that is that I think in China's judgment, and I happen to agree with it, it also happens to align with the US assessment, a North Korea with a significant nuclear weapons capacity and capability is fundamentally destabilizing, and it generates massive risks for the Asia-Pacific theater, because if something really does go south and people start pushing buttons, it's not the United States that's going to be hit by those or deal with the radioactive fallout. It's going to be obviously South Korea, and of course the North is going to get hit back. Japan is going to bear some consequences and casualties, and China is going to, whether or not it's directly in the conflict because of its geographic proximity. So there's no question that China doesn't want to see that happen. The last thing I'll say on this, just to be brief, is that I think both the United States and China have fundamentally been wrong in our assessment of the situation dating back decades. China fundamentally believed that there was a certain amount of diplomacy that could persuade North Korea to cease and desist from its pursuit of nuclear weapons. They were wrong. We fundamentally believed that there was a certain amount of sticks and sanctions and punitive actions that could dissuade North Korea from pursuing nuclear weapons, and we were wrong. All of us were wrong. And what we know now in retrospect, and perhaps some knew or understood at the time, was that the only way to stop North Korea from pursuing these weapons would have been to bomb it back to the Stone Age. I'm not saying that that's what I would have recommended or do recommend, but that would have been, in retrospect, the only thing that would have stopped them from their relentless pursuit. And the fact is, North Korea is now where it is, but China is no happier about it than we are. And they don't seem to have as much leverage as we sometimes think they do. Yep. But that being said, they're on the same side of the issue conceptually as we are.
And that's why everyone needs to read Sig Hecker's book if they've not yet read it. Ambassador Esquino.
Tony Blinken was all set to go to China, of course, and then there was the incident with the balloons. And from a public diplomacy point of view, looking at that, it was incredibly puzzling why China would risk doing something like that in terms of what it would do to the relationship. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. And also China's denial, and they were weather balloons and things that were not very convincing at the end of the day.
I'll be brief. It's a great question, Ambassador Aquino, thank you. I think the likeliest scenario is that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. It sometimes happens. We see it sometimes in the United States. We certainly see it in China. And I don't think that it was China's intention to have this embarrassing episode for which they themselves felt obliged to express regret, the specific term regret, which they hate to do. Anyone that understands Chinese culture, it is not a culture in which expressing regret comes easily. But they did. And to me, that suggests that this was something where this happened. It was not part of the plan. I don't think China wanted to scuttle the Blinken visit at that time. I think both the United States and China want to get this relationship to a place where the hemorrhaging stops, or at least pauses, and we can stabilize the relationship at some basic functional level. So, it happened. As the U.S. intelligence community and Defense Department noted at the time, the balloon, which as I pointed out at the time, injected even that more hot air into discourse on China in the United States, didn't give any, quote, additive value, unquote, that's the US term, to the Chinese in terms of what they were able to see and understand about our country. And in the end, it was much ado about fairly little. And I think it was a case of something got botched somewhere along the way. It was unfortunate, but as Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said just a few days ago, he's prepared and the United States is prepared to consider that matter resolved because we need to move on to issues that actually are much more consequential.
I see you.
At least it's Gary Powers wasn't flying the balloon. But in any case, just a quick question. Is Xi vulnerable given the fact that his economy is in the doldrums and his geopolitics seems to be pushing everybody into the U.S. orbit?
My personal assessment is I don't think so. I think President Xi Jinping has done a very good job of consolidating power, and he is obviously by far the most powerful person in China. He holds all the key positions. He seems, as far as I can tell, to have the strong backing of all the players that matter in China. And I can't foresee a situation in which he isn't able to run the country as he sees fit to run the country for the foreseeable future.
I want to ask you your thoughts. This is a potential scenario. Taiwan is important to America mostly because of Taiwan's semiconductor, because they build semiconductors for cars, planes, refrigerators, not the high-end stuff, but the stuff we use day to day. Okay, we are building our own semiconductor plants now. 5 years from now, when China is ready to invade Taiwan, we will hopefully have our own semiconductors factories here. We will hopefully have our own rare earth metal mines here. These are two of the essential things we need China for. We basically, what I think is going to happen is what Xi says. We're going to take over Taiwan, but he's going to wait 5-10 years. We're going to have our own semiconductor factories. We're going to have our own rare earth, and we're going to walk away from Taiwan.
So first of all, I think it's an interesting analysis, and it has some plausibility. Not saying that I agree with it, but it is not an implausible scenario that you're talking about. I think that the U.S. interest in Taiwan is about more than just the semiconductors. You are absolutely right when you say that that is a really important consideration right now. Some might posit that that is why President Biden actually said that the United States would defend Taiwan when in fact we don't defend Ukraine. And mind you, China, like Russia, is a nuclear weapons state with intercontinental reach that can destroy us. So the issue of nuclear deterrence is still there. So maybe that's one of the considerations in addition to those that I laid out. But I don't think that scenario is going to play out. I think the United States and others fundamentally see Taiwan as an incredibly vital and important partner, as a fellow democracy, as a place that shares our values, and as a place that in some ways complicates the geopolitics in a way that works to the advantage of the United States, of the Asia-Pacific region, and works in that regard works to the disadvantage of China. And I think the stakes are higher than just the semiconductors or rare earth materials, et cetera, minerals. So I don't think the United States is going to walk away from Taiwan. I'll say one last thing about this. Our stated policy, and Jim, we were talking about this earlier, and Secretary Blinken articulated it just recently in response to Dr. Haas, is one thing. We say that we root it in the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 communiques, the 6 assurances. We don't want a unilateral change of status quo, and we want peaceful resolution of the issue in ways that accord with the will of people on both sides of the strait. That's our policy, our stated policy. What that means is, in theory, if the people of Taiwan ever decided that they wanted to reunify or unify with China, that we would be okay with that. What I've argued it recently in public speeches and privately is that that is not the reality of American strategic sentiment. The fact is, within the constraints of extending formal diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China and not extending formal diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, otherwise known as the Republic of China, within that one constraint, in my judgment, the goal of U.S. policy toward Taiwan is to do everything humanly possible to prevent reunification from ever occurring. Now, that's not the stated policy, but in my judgment, that is the reality and the real policy intent. And I think if you took a poll in Congress, you'd get 100 people in the Senate agreeing with what I said, and approximately 435 in the House agreeing with what I said. And I think the executive branch, in many ways, would probably tacitly acknowledge that. They wouldn't acknowledge that publicly. My point being, we're in this thing at a deeper level, and the stakes are higher, and I don't think the United States ever walks away from Taiwan.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Let's take one back there, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, to what extent do you think there's cause for concern about China's increasing presence in Cuba?
The U.S. government has said that is something that has been going on for a while. I know it popped into the news recently, a week or 2 ago, but it's something that, according to the U.S. State Department, the White House, and others, they've been tracking for some time. I don't think it's one of the top concerns. I mean, look, China spies on us, we spy on them, powerful countries spy on each other, try to gain intelligence, try to understand what the other country is doing, what it's thinking, and so on. This is part of that broader effort. Whether it's particularly consequential or whether it really adds value to what China is otherwise doing, I'm not able to speak to that, but my guess is it probably doesn't add consequential value to what China's already doing in terms of spying against the United States. And meanwhile, we do the same thing to them as best we can. And that's just a part of what it is to live in this world as nations among nations. So it's an issue. The United States is well aware of it. It's one of many issues on the bilateral agenda. I don't think it cracks the top 10 in terms of importance to the President of the United States or the Secretary of State. Taiwan is up there, probably right at the top. South China Sea is up there. Human rights is up there, Xinjiang specifically, Hong Kong, the technology competition, and a number of other issues. So it's an issue on, in the mid-tiers, and it's not something that I think is something we should be unduly worried about, but it's something that I'm confident the U.S. government has the ability to monitor and deal with.
Tom, so if you'll wait for the microphone over to Mr. Johnson, and David, as we're waiting for the microphone to get over there, I'd like you to take 2 minutes to talk about an article that you wrote about the importance of trust in international relations, particularly with China. Take 2 minutes on that, and then we'll go to you, Mr. Johnson.
Thanks, Jim. So, as Jim noted, I recently published an article in a Chinese scholarly journal. I was asked to contribute something, and I did. And it was on the issue of trust in the U.S.-China relationship. And I often point out that the single most consequential deficit in the U.S.-China relationship is not the trade deficit, it's the trust deficit. And there is a profound deficit of trust. Just parenthetically, since I'm given 2 minutes, I'll take a few seconds. You know the joke about how do you know so-and-so is lying? Because his lips are moving? Well, what we say about, the analog I would use to describe Washington's view of China is, how do you know when China's doing something bad? And the answer is, when China's doing something. Because if China's doing it, according to Washington, it must be evil, nefarious, sinister, and designed to destroy America. By definition, because they're doing it. So that's where our trust is right now. And I made the point in this article that there are layers in terms of the origins of mistrust. It's not just that we disagree on Taiwan or disagree on human rights. At a much deeper level, there are civilizational and cultural origins of this mistrust. There's ideology, there's foreign policy doctrine, there's national interests, and then there's national style and what I call discursive method, or how we speak. And each of those 6 layers give rise to the distrust and the mistrust that exists in our relationship. And so the issues and the impediments to a qualitative improvement in the trust equation between the United States and China are much deeper than we often realize. And that's why there is a certain structural tension to the U.S.-China relationship that is never going to go away, because it's not actually about the issues, it's about these things that are beneath the surface that are churning and causing our nations to look at each other with not only primal angst, but with primal fear.
Is it true that
in spite of all the verbiage that goes on a day-to-day basis, there is a real exchange between Taiwan and the mainland, culturally, intellectually, etc.
That is true. And it has been true for a long time that hundreds of thousands of Taiwan folks, businessmen, scholars, students, average folks that are working, live in the mainland, disproportionately in Shanghai, but all across the country. And likewise, it's been much easier in recent years and decades for mainland Chinese to visit Taiwan. So the level of exchange between the mainland and Taiwan is pretty substantial. The Chinese in the mainland often argue that that contributes to the notion that we're all the same people, we're all brethren and brothers and sisters, we're all compatriots, that's the word that would be used. And, see, we're not that different, we're all Han Chinese, we're all Chinese, and so on. But in my judgment, it hasn't generated that outcome. If you look at Taiwan public opinion polling, you'll see that the trend line for 30 plus years has been away from a sentiment of being desirous of reunification or unification, and in favor of, at a minimum, maintaining the status quo. And as I would argue, if the threat of force or the use of force were not on the table on the part of the mainland, Taiwan would be independent tomorrow, if not tonight. But the threat of force and certainly the possible use of force are on the table, and that's what keeps the status quo where it is. But yes, the exchanges are there. Yes, in some ways the two sides, the mainland and Taiwan, understand each other a little better. But at the same time, I think what they in the mainland have come to understand is there is a divide there that is not going to easily be bridged. And the last point I'll make on this is an important one. In my judgment, my considered judgment, based on decades of looking at this issue, the people of Taiwan will never voluntarily unify with the mainland. That will never happen, ever. So the only way that ever happens, in my opinion, is through the use of force. But I just don't see any scenario where the people of Taiwan wake up one day and say a large majority or even a slim majority or even a significant plurality want to unify or reunify, particularly in the wake of what has happened in Hong Kong since the advent of the national security law that was adopted in June of 2020. And basically, people in Taiwan say, this is why we don't want one country, two systems. And as I said on Capitol Hill, last sentence on this, in 2014, if the people of Taiwan wanted one country, two systems, they'd already have it. Mm-hmm. So that's not going to happen.
What I want to do is, you had a question, sir. So if you'll give your brief questions, let's pass the mic over to you, and then you'll respond to both.
Yes, sir.
Would you comment on China's influence in Africa?
All right.
Yes.
And then we'll take the mic over here.
Very brief.
Wait,
yeah,
David.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Africa.
I'd like to take you on a different tack to end, and that is, what are your thoughts about the possibility of China imploding, given the falling birth rate? The article today in one of the major publications about 35-year-olds can't get work. There are no women for the young men to marry, and the labor force payment is catching up with the U.S., so the competitive advantage is gone or dropping. China's a nation with a history of warlords. Could it happen again?
That's a great question. So let me take both briefly. Only 3 hours per question. That's the limit. I'm not, Jim, I'm not going to do more.
But I think this means you're going to have to come back.
Yeah, well, absolutely. If I haven't worn out my welcome, which I hope I haven't. On Africa, briefly, China cares about Africa for various reasons: geopolitical, economic, trade, resources, energy. It comes at Africa from a fellow developing country mindset and platform, if you will, or national persona. And it approaches Africa in a way that's different than the United States does. When we talk about helping Africa, giving aid to some of the impoverished countries there, some of the lesser developed countries in Africa, we always attach strings and we say you have to do this and you have to do that and you've got to do it the way we want you to do it, and if you do, then you may qualify for some assistance from the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, or the Millennium Challenge Account, and so on and so forth. And China comes at it, in a sense, more pragmatically, less idealistically, and they say, look, we'll help you build this, we'll help you build that. You don't have to do anything the way that we do it. Govern how you want to govern. We really don't care how you govern, one way or the other. And there's a certain appeal to that kind of no strings attached mindset that China brings. So, China has established some strong relationships in Africa. I think it sees Africa potentially down the line as an increasingly important market for Chinese goods and services, and it wants to play the long game and get in with the continent as a fellow developing country that understands the challenges of Africa perhaps better or more viscerally than the United States does. That's what China would say as it markets itself. And so I think it cares about Africa, and it's going to continue to care about all the different parts of the world. To the point about implosion, in terms of, is that a possibility for China? I think it's a great question. I think all the points that you made are very important points. There is a demographic issue in a number of different ways. The aging of Chinese society, the fact that there is a non-alignment between marriageable men and marriageable women in terms of numbers, so that is a significant public policy problem and social problem in the country, and the various other issues that you mentioned around the economy, employment, and so on. At a high level, just to be brief, what I would say is the one thing that I have found to be true about China for a long, long time, and I've been going to China and dealing with China since 1984, is that China is an extraordinarily resilient country, and it is an extraordinarily adaptable country. It is, one can list the myriad ways in which China has adapted and flexed into new ways of thinking about issues that have allowed a country that some were writing back in the 1980s was on the verge of collapse to rise to become the number 2 economy in the world, one of the leaders in the world in terms of technology, one of the leaders in terms of quantum physics, one of the leaders in terms of artificial intelligence, one of the leaders in terms of patents, and the list goes on. I believe that the People's Republic of China, governed by the Communist Party of China, is going to endure for a very, very long time to come. I just think that's what's going to happen. Are the public policy challenges real? Absolutely. China has some profound domestic policy and foreign policy, but mostly domestic policy challenges on its national agenda. But I think that this is a party and a leadership that, whether one likes it or doesn't like it, and what the Communist Party stands for, it has a proven ability to find a way out when things look pretty dire. If you look at what China has bounced back from, the Cultural Revolution, before that, the Great Leap Forward, you're talking millions of people dead through its own mismanagement, its own failed domestic, tragically failed and brutal domestic policies and mistakes, and yet they've bounced back. I wouldn't bet against China continuing along and adapting for a very long time to come. Again, that's my assessment. There have been a lot of books that have predicted China's impending collapse. Makes me think of the Mark Twain line of, discussion of my death has been a bit premature, etc. I think China's going to be formidable. And the last thing I'll say is this. Two things are true about the United States-China relationship at the same time, and we have to understand it to calibrate our policy correctly. Number one, China is the most formidable national competitor that we will ever have in the lifetimes of every American drawing breath today, including the infants born recently. And it is also true that China is an indispensable partner to the United States, whether we like it or not. And if we can understand that both of those seemingly contradictory statements are in fact true at the same time, we will calibrate this relationship right and get to a much better place. Thank you all so much.